Well, Simon, this is exciting. We've got a new sponsor.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're being sponsored by PinGui Bags International, who are based in Oxford's world famous covered market.
They also have a website, don't they, where you can buy things. But you've got one of their products in front of you. What's that?
I do. It's absolutely beautiful, actually. It's a smaller bag. It's called La Petite Crêperie Mini Grace, and it's from their latest their spring summer range. And it's a vegan leather limited edition clutch bag. And I have to say, it's beautiful. So it actually literally looks like a little shop front, and it's beautifully made. So you have one too, Tim?
I do. So this is called the London 234 Crossbody Go Anywhere bag. It's made from canvas by Troop London, a British company. It's made from eco-friendly materials, and it's beautifully handcrafted. It's got lots of pockets, and it really is fantastic. So I'm certainly going to be using this to come down to the podcast with all my bits and bobs in it.
It does suit you, actually.
No, it does. It's great.
And so PinGui refresh their range twice yearly. So if you want to know more, it's really best to head over to their website to have a look. And we'll provide a link at the bottom of this video.
And thank you very much, PinGui, for sponsoring us. I hope we sold some bags for you.
And while you're there taking a look at their website, please also hit like and subscribe to Science of the Times. Hi everyone, I'm Syma Khalid.
And I'm Tim Colson, and welcome to another episode of Science of the Times.
So, Tim, what have you been up to this week?
Now, it's kind of been a fairly typical week. Yeah, I don't really know, to be honest. I did some gardening at the weekend. And I was on, maybe that was 2 weeks ago, I was on the Life Scientific. I don't know if we talked about that, maybe not. But anyway, if we didn't, another plug.
Well, I listened to it and it was fantastic. Really, really cool. So well worth a listen, folks. Listen to Jim Al-Khalili questioning Tim on Life Scientific.
No, fantastic. And actually, you have been up in Bradford. You were doing a really big talk, weren't you, to the British
It was a Muslim institute
Yeah.
invited me to give the second Ibn Sina lecture. And it was really nice. It was in the City Hall in Bradford, hosted by the Lord Mayor. So it was took my parents over and they had a great time. So it was fun.
And it went well, I assume.
I think so. Yeah, lots of questions, lots of interesting questions about not just science and medicine, but AI. Actually, sort of these topics that we've covered in the podcast and come up again and again. People sort of concerned, I think, about what the future has in store when it comes to AI.
No, well, congratulations on being asked to do that. That's a real honor. And I bet you were a bit nervous. I would have been.
I was very nervous, especially when the mayor walked in all his gold, and I was,
Oh, wow.
sat there thinking, "Oh, better do a good job here."
He was all blinged up, was he?
That's right.
Cool. Well, today we've got a chap called Max Telford on. And so he's a bit like me. He's a zoologist, but he's actually interested in the tree of life.
Cool, and he's just written a book, sort of going through the journey and trying to solve the big question. So, where do we all come from, and how are we all related?
No, that's right. And he really focuses in particular on the animal tree of life, but he does go right the way back to life's beginnings. So it's a good read. Well, should we get him on?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Fantastic. So Max has now joined us on the line. Max, would you like to introduce yourself and say a little bit about who you are and where you are?
So I'm Max Telford. I'm a zoologist at University College London. I've been interested for 35 years, perhaps a little bit more, in the animal tree of life. So I'm a zoologist rather than just a general biologist. And I've been working on some of the thornier problems of how big animal groups fit together and how they're related to each other.
And all the best people are zoologists. I obviously been professor of zoology. So congratulations on your new book that just came out last month. I really enjoyed reading it. And it's called The Tree of Life, Solving Science's Greatest Puzzle. And that's published by John Murray. So we'll put a link below for our readers, our listeners, so they can they can go and read it, and I thoroughly recommend it. It's worth reading. I know you've had a look at it as well, haven't you?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely fascinating, and I think for me, not only did I find the book fascinating, but I was also found it fascinating your fascination with, with the tree of life and trying to sort of get to the bottom of this, billion year, journey really. And sort of, and I'm interested in what sort of before we get into the book and what it's about, what that motivation is and where it comes from.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been thinking about this, and I think it. I mean, I became a zoologist because I loved animals and I was interested in natural history as a teenager. And I think the two big influences that got me going were first Jacques Cousteau. I really wanted to be a marine biologist, and aged 18, I went and trained to become a scuba diver and then realized I got incredibly seasick. So that was kind of ruled that one out. And the other big influence was David Attenborough's Life on Earth series, which both the series, which is obviously beautifully made, incredible natural history videos, but also the book, which I read multiple times as a teenager. So I absolutely loved zoology. But I think that the other thing about Life on Earth is that it's, in a sense, it's a phylogenetic book. It takes a trip up the tree of life, starting at the origin of life, right, 4 billion years ago, and moving up, sort of gradually heading towards humans. And I sort of take, rather cheekily or perhaps obviously, take a similar path towards the end of my book when I try and take a sort of broader view of what the tree of life actually looks like, but with a focus on ending up at humans.
And so, have you always enjoyed classifying things? Because as you talk about in the book, there are various branches to the tree of life. So I imagine you have, as a kid, for example, with all of your books in like perfect alphabetical order, or pots of fossils or something.
I'm not like that, and I wasn't like that as a teenager. Actually, I was sort of more going and digging out things out of cattle troughs and raising up mosquito larvae and stick insects and things. So I wasn't one of these undergraduates who already knew, every species of butterfly and etc. I remember there was one guy when I was an undergraduate who discovered a new species of woodlouse in the college garden where his university college. I wasn't like that, but I guess I'm more interested in the big picture. I've classifying. I've done some classifying. I've named a couple of branches of the tree of life.
Mhm.
I guess my interest. I mean, I do have a slightly geeky interest in more knowing the shape of it and the what that all means. Sort of it gets tacked on later. So I think that's a slightly geeky bit to me that I'm very interested in. The mechanics of how we discover the truth, what the shape of the tree of life is. But the point of the tree of life is not just to classify; it's to recreate, to travel back in time and to know what happened in evolution.
So, Max, if we just take a step back for those of our listeners who perhaps are a little bit unfamiliar with what the tree of life actually means, can you just explain what you mean when you say the tree of life and what it's trying, what it does?
Well, you could sort of think of it from the top down or from the bottom up. And from the top down, it's like looking at everything around us today. Oh, you can see the trees in my garden. It's London, so there's loads of wildlife. There's foxes, there's parakeets. So how all of those many different species of life, from humans to plants to bacteria to fungi, how they're all related. What's the family tree that unites all of those? Going back in time, where do they meet? In the past? When did they have a common ancestor? But it might be easier to think of it from the bottom up. Think of the very first species of life on Earth. It's a species that certainly existed. We call it Luca, the last universal common ancestor. And you can think of that sprouting up like a tree, and at some point that single species dividing into two, and that's going to form eventually two huge branches that still survive today. And those branches will go on to split and to split and to split to make more and more species. And those, as those species go up, they evolve, they change, they evolve new characters, they become plants or mammals or animals, mammals, whatever. And it is that tree-like process of branching and moving through time and evolving and becoming different that has produced what we can see outside my window here, which is
And that
the huge
branching,
diversity of life.
that branching started a long time ago, right? Life is old. It's been around for a while.
Life is, as far as we can tell, about 4 billion years old. We've got fossils from about 3.5 billion years old, but rocks, 4 billion year old rocks are very, very rare, if not, non-existent. So there are, well, sorry, they do exist, but they don't have fossils in them. But there are signatures of life, so molecules that is produced by life and not by geological processes that we can discover in rocks that are 4 billion years old, which is basically as old as we're able to discover on the planet.
And the last universal common ancestor was a bit later than that. Is that right? So life existed before Luca, but we don't know what that life looked like.
So I think probably Luca existed about 4 billion years ago, but there was a period before Luca, which is effectively, so we can reconstruct what Luca looked like by following the tree down to that very, very earliest branching point. And if we look at those two branches coming out of Luca, there are the branch which is the bacteria, and there's another branch which is bacteria-like things called archaea. If we compare what their descendants, the things that are alive today, have in common, by logic, those things in common in those very ancient branches must have come from their common ancestor, which we can extrapolate back to. Essentially, we can go right back in time to Luca because we can extrapolate back from their modern descendants. But before Luca, there's no other branches coming off it. There were other branches. There were presumably several species, many species, around at the same time as Luca, but they've all gone extinct, and Luca is the only one that's actually given rise to anything that's still alive today.
So when you mean they've gone extinct, we mean that nothing came forth from them afterwards, right? It was like the end of the line. Is that right?
They might have gone on, after the existence of Luca, but at some point they went extinct. So we've got no trace of them today, and no way of tracing back down their branch to get to a place on the tree that is lower, is further back in time than Luca.
But your real interest is in animals, isn't it? And then, so the first animals, genetics tells us what, about 800 million years ago, the first fossils.
There's a big argument about this.
I know.
So we can't find the first animal fossils. We're very unlikely to find the very first one of a branch. We'll find them eventually. Fossils are quite rare, especially nearly a billion years old. But we can sort of estimate when they're likely to have existed by comparing how different things are today and knowing how quickly differences build up in our genes. So if two things are 10% different, and 1% things become different at 1% per million years, then 10% different means they're 10 million years separated. So we can sort of estimate when the first animals existed, and this is where it gets tricky. And I'm not a great expert on this. I'm basically a skeptic about molecular clocks.
Okay. So the molecular clock is that 10% thing you were just talking about.
Exactly. Yeah, so yeah. The molecular clock lets us use the difference, especially in the genes between two existing creatures, two species, and to use that difference to estimate how distantly related they are effectively. And using the molecular clock, people come up with estimates of the animals probably about 600 million years old. But so that's for the bilaterians, actually. So that's for the major group of animals. But the first fossils are 120 million years younger than that. So there's this huge gap in the fossil record between where the molecular clocks tell us that the animals first appeared and when we actually first see the first one. And it's a big source of argument. There was a meeting in Canada last week where everyone thought about it.
And what makes you such a skeptic? Just because the fact there are no fossils, sort of.
Because I have watched the gap between the molecular clock estimates of when animals first appeared and the fossil estimates, which haven't changed, get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller over the last 20 years. So the first molecular clock estimates for the first appearance of animals was 1.2 billion years ago, and now it's about 600 million years. Essentially, the clocks, as they get better, are converging on what we can see in the fossil record, essentially.
But we also don't know what those first animals would have looked like, do we? I mean, they're presumably not much more than a sort of a mouth and a gut, surrounded by cells, presumably. But we don't really know what they would have looked like. So that must make, and they're probably small, so that's going to make it hard to find as well.
Well, we've got, so what, I guess what, so just like Luca, so there will be animals before the first of the animals that gave rise to all the animals alive today. So there were animal-like things, and at some point we've got what we call the crown group of animals. And so that is the last common ancestor of all, the most recent common ancestor of all the animals that are alive today. So that's the ancestor of humans and jellyfish and sponges. So a sponge is a very, very simple animal. And so we can certainly look at all the descendants of that very first animal. We call it the metazoan, the animal. And we look at the descendants and we can see what's in common between them. And most obviously, they're all large. They've got lots and lots of cells. And there are other large things. The plants are large and fungi are large, but this is something that lived in the bottom of the sea. If we find something at 1,000 meters depth, it wasn't a plant because there's no light there. So we do find fossils about 570, 600 million years ago that are large, obviously have lots of cells. And we know from the paleontology, I'm not a paleontologist, so I'm guessing a little bit, or I'm exaggerating my knowledge a little bit. But we know that they weren't plants because they were living in deep water, etc. So we've got some things that clearly were animals because of where they lived and and how big they are, and it's trying to fit those in with the animals we know today and trying to see whether they're similar or whether they're a unique group that's sort of gone extinct and left nothing alive today.
And so when those when those fossils are analyzed, is that a genetic analysis of the fossils?
No, there's no DNA. The oldest DNA is a couple of million years old, and we're talking 600 million years old. So there's no DNA at all. All you've got is the impression of the animal's body or the species body left in the rock. So it's the shape. And sometimes you can. I really shouldn't go too deeply into this. I'm not a paleontologist, but sometimes, different structures, like your nerve cord or our nerve cord, a vertebrate's nerve cord. A jellyfish doesn't have a nerve cord, but if you've got a nerve cord, there's a lot of phosphorus in that for whatever reason, and that fossilizes differently. So sometimes you can see that this structure, this long, thin structure, was probably a nerve cord rather than any other bit of the body. I'm definitely straying off my expertise here. Well, probably saying the wrong elements, etc., etc. But the point is made.
Yeah.
Let's bring it back to something that you have spent a lot of time studying. Bilaterians. It's a word you met before, and it basically means that anything that's like a tube-like animal with a mouth and actually, I think there's some bilaterians that only have one entrance, but I tend to think of bilaterians as worm-like animals, and I think worms are one of your, you write a lot about worms and bilaterians, but tell us about when the bilaterians arose and what they are and how we kind of how they've become so incredibly common.
Yes, so bilaterians, we can see that the bilaterian body plan was very successful because nearly all animals are bilaterian. So a bilaterian is simply something like me that's got a head at one end and a tail at the other, a dorsal, like your back, which is different from your belly.
I haven't got a tail.
You have. A front end and a back end, a head end and a not head end, a back and a belly, which are different from each other.
They're not symmetrical.
And a left and a right, and that leaves you with a left and right, which are mirror images of each other. So that's where the name comes from. They're bilaterally symmetrical. They've essentially got a left side, which is a mirror image of their right side. And this body plan, and it's probably nothing to do with the symmetry. It's probably to do with having a head at one end, a gut with a mouth at one end, and an anus at the other, food going through, and various elaborations of that body, which is sort of kind of more purposeful than a jellyfish. It's got a direction of travel which is forward and and you end up with a brain at one end and various sensory organs at one end, your eyes and taste, etc. And they're much more, they've become very successful. It was obviously a very good idea, a very successful body plan. So almost all major kinds of animals are bilaterians, and indeed almost all animals are bilaterians, because most animals are insects.
And when did they arise, the bilaterians? I think late Ediacaran, early Cambrian. But they were popular. They were doing well by the early Cambrian, weren't they?
Well, so the Cambrian is, the change between the Ediacaran and the Cambrian is defined by the first appearance of bilaterian fossils. And actually, these fossils are not fossils of bodies, but they're trace fossils, something called Treptichnus. So these are essentially a bilaterian animal scrabbling around on the bottom, leaving a mark in the sediment, and that mark, essentially that trackway, becoming fossilized.
And it looked like a worm, did it?
That looked like probably something like a priapulid or a penis worm, which is something alive today. And so essentially what it is you've got this worm-like thing, and you can see from the marks that it's made that it was sort of had a head end that was searching around looking for food. And that's kind of telling us it's probably a little cleverer than a jellyfish, which is sort of, rather aimless, wandering around the sea, pulsing its umbrella. So this is something crawling around looking for food, with a front end and a back end which are different from each other.
And if our listeners, very carefully type penis worm into Google, they will understand why it's been named along those lines.
Well, the scientific name is Priapulus, which was given to it by Linnaeus, and yes, it has the same meaning.
It's appropriate. We should probably think about going to having a quick break and going to our sponsors. So we'll be back in a couple of minutes when we will continue, and we'll sort of move up towards the modern day, I suspect.
Hi, Tim. You're looking particularly snazzy today. What are you wearing?
I'm wearing a piece from a company called Grace and Garbo. And actually, you know a little bit more about them than I do, to be honest.
Yeah, you're right, I do. And
you're the fashion queen. Yeah.
I'm also wearing a piece from Grace and Garbo. So this is a delightful knitwear outfit set up in Birmingham. What they do is they source knitwear, quality knitwear from all around the world. So it's vintage, one-off pieces, many of which they then hand embellish, like the one you're wearing today with its beautiful purple flowers. And so they're big on sustainability. Nothing goes to waste. Everything is sort of recycled and reused. And if you want to know more about them, then have a look at the link beneath this episode.
And thank you very much to them for supporting our podcast. I hope their sales soar.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Grace and Garbo.
Well, welcome back, and welcome again to our guest, Max Telford, who's recently published The Tree of Life, Solving Science's Greatest Puzzle, published by John Murray. And we're in the Cambrian, and the Cambrian explosion is something that had even been discovered when I was at school. But it was an important time for animals, wasn't it, Max?
I think even Darwin knew about it. Darwin thought of this as one of his abominable mysteries. Why?
Yeah, he was a few years ahead of me.
So why this sudden appearance of the conundrum is that out of nowhere you don't get just a bilaterian, an animal with a left and a right. You get all sorts of different ones. So you get arthropods and penis worms, and primitive fish-like things, and primitive mollusk-like things, and I could probably go on a few more. So these appear as if from nowhere, but we know they're all related, and we know that they must have had some time to become different from each other. You can't become as different as an arthropod is from an earthworm instantaneously. So that some time must have passed before their common ancestor existed, and between the point at which their common ancestor existed and at which they appear in the fossil record. So I sort of hinted at this before, that this estimate of when they first appeared is older than their first actual appearance in the fossil record, and so there's this this conundrum that people are still arguing about.
So, Max, geographically, these appearances, are they all over the world when they start appearing, or are there sort of discrete localizations?
They're all over the world, but I think that the thing to and they're sort of spread out in time. So the Cambrian lasts for millions, tens of millions of years, and the most famous ones actually are Middle Cambrian. So these are the famous Burgess shale fossils. So this isn't the first appearance, but yeah, they're found all over. They're found all over the world. Well, not everywhere, because rocks that old are rare, but where we find rocks that old, we're finding evidence of bilateral animals.
And that was back in the time of just all the land where there was nothing living on the land. Obviously, plants hadn't
No.
lived it. And was it just one big continent?
Yes, you've got me there, Tim.
Okay, don't worry.
Certainly the continents were moving around, and I think you're right that Pangaea was around at the time of the Cambrian explosion.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think it's important for our listeners just to get an idea of the scope of what we're talking about here, right? So the time span is millions of years. The geography is all over the world, which the Earth doesn't look like it looks like now. And so to try and put that into a sort of, not put it into a modern context, but in the world we are in now, and there's I guess a level of imagination also that has to come into it when you're trying to piece these things together and imagine the world. You don't have photographs or anything like that of, what it looked like then. So I guess the layers of complexity are enormous, right?
Yeah, and it's these millions and billions. It's hard to picture these, and so I use in the book I use this sort of human timescale to try and get some idea of how much time is passing, and what's extraordinary. So my human timescale is the soles of its feet are the beginning of the formation of the Earth, which is about 4.5 billion years ago, and the very top of the head is today. And so as we move up that body, we can see things happening and sort of get some grasp of when it happened in the history of the Earth. And what's extraordinary is that on that timescale, the animals appear at the bottom of the chin. So really, really recent thing. And humans, it's the cell, the last cell on the top of your head. It's incredibly recent on that in the geological timescale.
So let's kind of think a little bit about the process. So of how evolution works and how new characteristics are made. So you have a chapter on the insect wing, for example, and where insect wings came from that I thought was really fascinating. So perhaps explain, where we think insect wings come from and why we think that's the case, because it really is. It goes all the way back to one of the animals that was swimming around in the Cambrian, one of the predators, no less.
Yeah, so there's been actually rumbling on for probably 100 years is an argument about how insect wings first evolved, and there were really two ideas. The first is that essentially we had a wingless insect with a carapace, so that the exoskeleton, the body effectively, which had a slight flaring sticking out, and these flared bits gave it some minor ability to glide, and this was something that could be picked up on by evolution and exaggerated, and the gliding would get better and better and better. So theory number one, the wings are part of the dorsal, the exoskeleton, the skeleton on the back of the animal. And then the second idea is that we know that insects are relatively closely related to crustaceans, and crustaceans at the bottom of their legs have a sort of flappy bit sticking out, which is a gill, because crustaceans live in the water, and they have these feathery things sticking out which absorb oxygen from the water and do various other things. And so the other idea is that when insects, which came from the crustaceans, when they emerged from the water, they still had these gills, and they essentially used that flappy thing and used it to in some way to help them glide and then flap and then have powered flight, etc., etc. And the way we've tried to differentiate between these is by looking at gene expression. And what we've actually found, what's been found recently, is that if you look at the genes that are switched on in the cells of a crustacean gill, we find the same genes switched on in the cells of an insect wing. So suggesting that they're essentially the same structure, because they share these two structures which share a lot in common. They're special genes involved in building an insect's gill are the same genes that are involved in a crustacean's gill are the same genes involved in building an insect's wing.
But it took a long time, right? So
it would have been very slow, and quite possibly the gills. Many of the most primitive insects still spend a lot of their life in water. Things like mayflies and dragonflies, etc. And they have gills, and the gills they're at the end of the body in mayflies and dragonflies, but they have those same genes that are switched on in other crustacean gills and other bits of the body and in insect wings.
So it's a bit of a story of evolution, really finding a way to co-opt genes that did one thing. Evolution rarely sort of comes up with a whole new characteristic like wings or like a large neocortex from scratch. It often kind of uses genes that it repurposes genes and for new purposes. That happens again and again, and something that you kind of cover in the book a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess in this context, you'd think of it on a slightly larger scale. You'd think of it as repurposing a gill. And the gill is obviously built by genes. But sometimes we think of genes being repurposed because an enzyme that does one thing then gets repurposed and does something similar but different. But in this case, it's a whole structure being repurposed in very much the same way that the front legs of a dinosaur have become repurposed to become the wings of a bird. So it's the same structure with the same bones, built by the same genes, but it's been changed gradually over time in the same mysterious process. Something developed to, a flying dinosaur is fairly extraordinary.
Yeah. And it's great that dinosaurs are still around in the form of
yeah.
Men and dinosaurs, right? It's a strange thing. Men are always fascinated by dinosaurs.
We had a pet emu a few years ago when my father-in-law's farm, he rescued it, and that emu made me realize that yes, dinosaurs would have been terrifying, and this was like a dinosaur. It was an awful animal.
Yeah.
I think my favourite, obviously, probably know what I'm going to say, Tim, being essentially a bacteriologist. I think my favourite really is the mitochondrion, right? Just it's essentially was probably a bacterium.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. So I talked about a while ago. I talked about these two branches coming out of Luca. One being the bacteria. The eubacteria, the proper bacteria, and the other being the archaea, which used to be called the archaebacteria. So these are very, very simple creatures, tiny single-cell creatures. But at some point, one species of eubacterium and one species of archaean have come together to form a completely new cell, which is a much more complex cell. And so that the archaebacterium has essentially turned into the mitochondria in all eukaryotic cells. So all of our cells and all eukaryotic cells, so all largish cells, complex cells, have this structure called a mitochondrion, which is literally another creature living inside our cells, and it's been there for billions of years, couple of billion years.
And the animals couldn't have happened unless eukaryote cells evolved, right? And that we are eukaryotes, as are plants and fungi and what have you.
Correct, people always talk about the inevitability of things. I think it wasn't very inevitable to get animals. It took 2 billion years before anyone had the idea of making an animal. So it wasn't an obvious thing to do.
No, that's fair enough. So how complete is the animal tree of life then? I mean, is your job done? You've written this book. Can I finally retire as a zoologist?
I think, well, there's various ways in which it's not complete, thank goodness, and my career continues. First of all, there's bits we argue about. So some of it's easy. It's very obvious that mammals all belong together and that birds belong somewhere else. So there's big bits of the tree which we can say very confidently we've solved this bit. But the bits I work on are the tricky bits where we've got weird organisms which have thrown away half their genes or become very simple in other ways. There's occasions on the tree where lots of species appeared all at once. And so untangling their exact relationships is very, very difficult. So these things called adaptive radiations, a good example being the Darwin's finches, or the fishes in the African Great Lakes. So there's lots of bits of the tree which I think are very important and need sorting out, and I argue with people over and have been doing for the last 30 years. So there's plenty still to solve, and there's mistakes we've been made that need correcting, etc. And the other way in which it's incomplete is all the species, all the extinct ones that we're never going to know because they haven't left fossils. Almost no bacteria have left. There's probably literally trillions of bacterial species that have gone extinct and we'll never know about. There's lots of things alive today that we don't know yet. There was a paper a couple of weeks ago where somebody took 1 teaspoon of soil, sequenced it using the very latest sequencing technology, and found genomes, so DNA, from about 800 species of mostly bacteria, almost none of which were known to science before. So that's 1 teaspoon of soil from one place in the world. So there's millions, and according to some people, 1 trillion species alive today that we have no idea about yet. And then, of course, there's the future, which we don't know what's going to happen, and that I'm not going to worry too much about that. Not a lot I can do about that.
Well, what's the thing that I guess sort of what's your next big thing, Max? What's the thing that you feel most excited about now, sort of moving on with your work?
Well, I slightly quixotic quest, I suppose, which we went a couple of years ago to Argentina in search of a worm, which would be very interesting if it exists. So this is a worm called Salmonella, and it was described in the late 19th century by a German called Johannes Frenzel, and he was in Argentina. So he wrote various papers about it. He described it as the simplest animal that exists at all alive today. So it's basically a tube.
He hasn't met my dog Woofler. He's not a simple animal. Anyway, I'm joking. He's obviously quite complex.
Even simpler than Woofler. Salmonella, if Frenzel is to be believed, is simply a tube of cells. So it's a gut and nothing else. So a mouth at one end, anus at the other, and nothing else to it at all. And so it would be very exciting to go and discover this, to study this simplest of all animals, if it really is that simple. But nobody's seen it since Frenzel described it in the late 19th century.
And is that because the habitat it lived in is gone, do you think? I mean, you mentioned in the book that it's probably, the salt marshes, I think it was, where he said he'd found it, don't really exist there anymore.
Yeah, so we went there, and it's the Argentinian Pampas, which is just a huge flat area to the east of the Andes, and presumably, I don't know, I wasn't there in the 19th century, but it was covered with pampas grass and little else. And that today, we went there a couple of years ago. It's completely and utterly covered with farms. So as you drive along, there's nothing but soya and alfalfa and whatever else, and they're all fenced off. So it's very difficult to go look for potential sources of this creature. But slightly worse than that is the ambiguous papers that Frenzel wrote. So they were sort of, written quite professionally and published in good journals. But the methods section leaves a lot to be desired, shall we say? So he describes how he got a soil sample, salt and mud in it, from a friend of his, from the region of Rio Cuarto, which is where we went, but doesn't say where. So we don't even know if the region of Rio Cuarto means within a mile of the town or within 50 miles of the town. So it's not easy to start with. And then he puts this sample in some water, and then he leaves it on a windowsill for about 3 months, and he tops it up with tap water from time to time, and he puts in some pondweed, and at one point he says he drops a bit of iodine in, but it sounds like it was a mistake or an accident, and he doesn't tell us how much. And then after 3 months, he discovers in the bottom of this, this jar on his windowsill, this magical and potentially very, very exciting worm. Our most distant animal relative, if Frenzel is to be believed.
It's still alive.
Still alive, yeah, and happily reproducing.
Sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? Really?
So I forgot to mention at one point he says quite a lot of sand and flies blew into the water through the window. So honestly, we don't know where the soil sample came from. We don't know where the worms came from, and the whole thing is very mysterious. But anyway, we got there having studied Google Maps and looked for possible sources of salty, sandy soil. So we're looking for bare patches with a white crust. You can zoom in on Google, and a tiny number of them were within sort of reach of a track or a road. We couldn't actually get to them because it was all fenced off. But my colleague Philip, who I was with, had a drone. So we went zooming in, looking down, and then inevitably there was. It was just a muddy pool or something. So what we've really discovered is how difficult it is going to be to rediscover this worm.
If it actually did exist.
If it isn't a figment of Frenzel's imagination.
Yeah. I think the reviewers of that paper need to have a word of themselves, right?
No, I think that's right. Well, I mean, I think we're kind of running out of time, so we better draw this to a close. But I mean, good luck with your continued research and finding that worm. And I mean, we could talk and talk and talk, but your book published by John Murray, The Tree of Life, Solving Science's Greatest Puzzle, is well worth a read. And thank you very much, Max, for coming on our podcast. And I think we've both really enjoyed talking to you.
If you find the worm, please come back.
I will do, without a doubt.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, I thought that was really interesting, Syma. I mean, I thought I did some slightly kind of bonkers field work, but imagine going off to Argentina to dig around for a worm that someone from a couple of 100 years ago or 150 years ago claimed to have found.
Yes, it was quite funny. I was wondering, the person who wrote the paper, was he totally sober? Had he smoked something? Can we test that? But I mean, remarkable commitment to his field, just to go out there and look for that. And I sincerely hope he finds it.
I tell you one thing I really loved, trying to understand quite how long life has been around. I hadn't heard his analogy until I read his book about going up the height of the human body and sort of how at what point different animals and different life forms arose. Really fascinating. So
we're here, right? So sort of animals are at the chin level, is that right?
That's right. And then like humans are just like the very top layer of skin. So we think we're so important, we've been around for ages, but actually, we're just less than a blink of an eye of geological time.
Absolutely. I think at school I really struggled with the spatial scales of biology, which of course you don't have in the same way in chemistry. And then now on top of that, when you consider the temporal scales as well, it becomes quite mind-boggling, I think.
No, it does. But I thought he did a great job. And I have to say, I enjoyed talking to him, but I did enjoy his book. So I'd encourage our listeners to go and have a read.
For sure. Absolutely.
Okay. So and then what are we doing next week?
Next week, we have Ian next week, right?
Ian Goldin. I think that's right. I think we're going to be talking about migration and how important it's been over human history.
That's right. So it's specifically human migration over, again, a long time span. I actually heard Ian give a talk at the Woodstock Book Festival, a science festival, a few weeks back, and he did a great job. And I was thrilled when he agreed to come on the podcast.
No, it's great. It's fantastic. Well, I look forward to that. But otherwise, have a good week.
Yep, I'll see you around, Tim.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye everyone.